Fun Ideas Productions presents the Fun Ideas Podcast.
This is the Slow Poisoner. I come to you from the future with these words of warning.
It's a hot horror planet. 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 Living in science fiction. Past the point of no returning. We got high on gasoline. And we blew the scene.
Hi, this is Mark Arnold, and welcome to Fun Ideas Podcast number 73. This episode is sponsored by the fine folks at Lee's Comics. Attention comic book fans, Lee's Comics of Mountain View, California has closed. But here's the good news. Lee's Comics eBay store is still going strong with over 10,000 vintage comics, the majority of which are now on sale, for half off. Choose from Lee's huge stock of golden, silver, bronze, and modern age comics, and specializing in Silver Age Marvel titles. You can count on friendly service, accurate grading, and quick, secure shipping backed by a money-back guarantee. To check out Lee's eBay store, go to eBay. Click Advanced Search to the left of the search bar, scroll down to Sellers, and enter Lee's Comics Inc., period. That's LeeScomics Inc., period. Don't forget the period. Lee's Comics is shipping daily with no delays. New items daily. Mention the Fun Ideas Podcast and get a free bonus gift. Welcome to Season 3. We have a new theme song by Andrew the Slow Poisoner Goldfarb, and he will be a returning guest in a few weeks to discuss his new songs and his magazine, Freaky. The pandemic continues, and that's why I decided to record a few more episodes that will last at least until the end of June for your enjoyment. As always, please let me know how I'm doing with your comments and subscriptions and Patreon support. You know my other books, but if you don't, go to Amazon and follow author Mark Arnold. Make sure it's me and my books. You'll know because the books are all about animation, comic books, and music. Any other subjects are most likely by another Mark Arnold. All of my books are available in hardback, paperback, and ebook, except for the 2 cracked history books and my first Disney book, which don't have hardcover versions at this time. Since I assume you're still self-isolating, this is a good time to catch up on my earlier books. As for new projects, I'm still waiting for the Warren Kremer book and the second TTV book to come back to the publisher, and I'm working on my Mad book and second Disney book in the meantime. I'm also finishing up 4 articles for Back Issue Magazine, and I'm selecting cartoons for a new collection by Bruce Bollinger, for which I will also write a foreword. I'm supposed to appear at some point with my co-author Michael A. Ventrella to discuss our Monkeys books on Zilch, on Monkeys podcast, but it hasn't been scheduled yet. I'll let you know. Our guest today has had an extensive career in publishing. He currently is the editor and publisher of the American Bystander, a humor magazine available by subscription only. Here he is, Michael Gerber. Okay, on the phone today I have Michael Gerber. How are you?
I'm great. Nice to talk with you.
Okay, very good. And I guess tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got to be the, editor and publisher of the American Bystander. Is that the correct positions you have?
Sure. Everything, doer of everything for the magazine. How did I get to be here? Well, that's a huge, long question, or a huge, long answer to that question, because I'm one of those people who kind of figured out what I wanted to do at a very young age, or decided that I wanted to do something and just would not listen to reason, which is more accurate. So, when I was a kid, this was back in the 70s. When I was a kid, 5 and 6 years old, I was reading Mad magazine, which was very good back then, right, and National Lampoon, which was very good back then, and would actually tear apart the issues and tape them back together. I'm 6 years old. To get them in the order that I thought that they should be. Like, I don't like that article. I like this article.
Wow.
Yeah. And my mom was in art school. She was raising me by herself. She was in art school in St. Louis. We lived in St. Louis.
Mm-hmm.
And all of her friends could draw. And so when they would come to visit, I would grab them and be like, okay, listen, I got something I need you to draw. In the first panel, I want this. In the second panel, I want this. And it would really be scripts. It's exactly what I do today. So there's a lot of years in between. I wrote a humor column for my high school newspaper. My high school newspaper's a kind of a famous one outside of Chicago. It's a place called Oak Park. Ernest Hemingway used to write for the high school newspaper there. So you wrote a humor column for them. That plus good grades got me into Yale. Yale's humor magazine, Yale's version of the Harvard Lampoon, which is actually older, believe it or not, was in and out of business after Gary Trudeau left in 1970. So I resurrected it and put it on its feet for good.
Cool.
And then, was like at the end of college, and this is where I'll stop. But at the end of college, I really had a fork in the road. I could either be a historian, which is what I love, which is a love of mine, or I could be a comedy writer. And I felt I had some experiences that made me think that being a historian, I couldn't necessarily talk about the things I wanted to talk about or say the truths I wanted to talk about, because my love of the history I love is the history of the 60s and 70s, and that was still too recent for people to, for historians to really get into the nitty-gritty of that. So I decided to be a comedy writer, and then went down to New York and worked in magazine business for a bunch of years, worked in book publishing, published a parody of Harry Potter, which sold a zillion copies, and was not, had kind of been like, well, I would have meeting after meeting after meeting. I was a magazine consultant in my 20s, specializing in humor. So these big magazine companies would come in and they would say, we want to attract college kids, or we want to put humor in our mix. This would be Scholastic, or I forget the National Lampoon, certainly Spy, certainly.
Right.
People would call me up, and I would go in, and I would kind of analyze their publication and say, these are the problems I see. This is probably why you're not getting the response you want. But we never got anywhere with that. They would listen to me and they go, oh, okay, and then they would just keep doing the same thing. So I had kind of thrown my hands up with both magazine and book publishing, and was dealing with a chronic illness. In 2011, when Brian McConaughey called me up and said, I've got this, I tried to start this magazine in 1982, which was sort of halfway between the National Lampoon and the New Yorker. If you were going to do a magazine like that, how would you do it? And it was a really interesting kind of question from a publishing standpoint. And so I was so sick, I could only really talk to him for 15 minutes at a time. And so he and my third partner, Alan Goldberg, they would call, and I would say, okay, it's got to be priced like this, because it can't be advertising support, it has to be reader supported. And they'd say, why? And I'd give them the reason. Well, this is the reason. Yeah. So, okay, if it has to be priced like that, it has to really deliver this kind of experience. It has to feel more like a book than a magazine. Well, if that's the case, then it has to be printed on nice paper. And, slowly but surely, over about a year, I was putting into pieces all the theory behind the American Bystander now. And then as I got better, I was able to start doing designs, do full type tests. See, because for me, it's not just the editing, it's also like the whole look of the book, and it's more of an auteurist, kind of like a film director's way of doing a magazine.
Right.
So, so slowly but surely, putting together a full design, type tests. Well, what do we want it to feel like to the reader? What do we want it to evoke? What are the what kind of magazines do my contributors, like people like Brian and George Meyer and Jack Handy and all those people, what kind of magazines really can publish their kind of material particularly well, okay? Then what kind of technology are we going to have to use to print it efficiently, okay? And then you take both of those, and then that's how you get the design that I came up with for Bystander. And that took about a year of full type tests, meaning like you lay out full pages with type and with different sizes, different kerning, all sorts of stuff, and It's really it's cool. But yeah, so then I was planning on creating this magazine and giving it to Brian and saying, here you go, because I really wasn't. I was, getting over this illness and was like, okay, the second half of my life is starting. I was 45, whatever it was, and he looked at it after I did the first test issue. And he looked at it and he said, "Oh, you'd never do this. You should do this." And I'm like, "I don't want to do this. I want to do something else." But because the magazine business had really been nothing but sadness for me. I never got the opportunity. I never, found the friendly billionaire to give me a staff. So I wasn't under any illusions about what this would be. It would be a lot of work. But we did. We had a potential deal with a guy who was going to give us $1 million if we got some sons and daughters of Chinese businessmen and put them on our staff so they could get H-1 visas. And that fell through, luckily so, because I think we all would have gone to jail. And so I was sitting there with the first issue, and I was like, well, we've been working on this for so many years. I don't want it to just never be seen. So we kickstarted it, but I didn't have any sense that we'd make our Kickstarter or that there was this great, appetite for something like this, for a print humor magazine, classic print humor magazine. But the moment that we launched it, it was really clear there was an appetite, and all of a sudden, not only did I have a magazine, like I had a magazine that I had to do issue number 2 and 3 and 4.
Right.
So, now I just shipped 14 yesterday. I'm just about to send the PDF to all our PDF subscribers. But it's really been piece by piece.
Right.
It's happened that way, piece by piece.
Now, okay, go ahead.
I was just going to say, but it really is the way that this has gone down has been, readers have loved it. Readers have called me, and readers have emailed me, when is this going to happen? I want another. And so that's really what I get my vim and vigor from, is people going, oh, this is great. I remember when magazines were like this, or oh, that was a great piece, or whatever.
Now, my major question is, did you ever try to do it in the traditional way, or is that with the $1 million and the H-1 visa and all that stuff, of just newsstand distribution, or did you dismiss that right off the bat?
Well, I'll tell you this. The whole corporate magazine, there's basically one model for corporate magazines, which it depends on scale, and it depends on a lot of capital. So, the only people who can really run this model are people who are willing to put $5 million or $10 million into the front end of the Sneetch machine, and then at the end, you hope that it actually, how it works is you put the money in at the beginning, and you're hoping that by year 3 you've broken even, and by year 5 you're making money.
Right.
So it's very capital intensive. For example, this is one thing. I did a parody of the Wall Street Journal back in 1996, and we could never get it on the newsstand because I remember having lunch in New York with a guy who was a newsstand consultant, a very nice guy. But I bought him lunch, so maybe that's why he was being nice. And his first question to me was, well, do you have $10,000 in unmarked bills, like paper bag money? And I said, what? And he said, well, if you want to get this on in the airports, in the airport newsstand, that's the first thing you're going to have. And I was like, oh, I'm a kid from the suburbs. I didn't realize that. I didn't realize that the Corleone family was still around. But yeah, so magazine publishing is like that, in that only big companies really have the capital and the relationships to get something on the newsstand. And when you get something on the newsstand, there's really not very much way to track how your sales are. So, for example, if you ship 100 copies, it wouldn't be 100 copies. It would be called your draw. If your draw was 100,000 copies, and in 3 months, your newsstand people, all your newsstand people said, you sold 27,500 copies. What do you want us to do with the rest? Do you want us to ship them back to you? Well, no, of course you don't, because it's going to cost you to ship them and pulp them. So you go, no, I don't want them. And if you sold, say you sold 75,000 instead, you don't know. So it's all a cash business. It's very crooked in that way. At least it used to be. I don't know. Maybe it's so small time now because there's so many fewer newsstands that there's less corruption in it. But back then, back in the 90s even, it was definitely like that. It was definitely like, if you don't have a lot of capital and or a big brother, meaning it's not a Hearst publication or Hachette or Condé or whatever else, you're not going to have the relationships and the leverage to get your thing on the newsstand. And that had changed with consolidation. Tony Hendra and a bunch of people were able to do a parody of a Wall Street Journal in 1982, and it sold a ton. But the business was less consolidated then, so they could get on the newsstand. So the first thing with Bystander I had to do was figure out, well, if everything's, can I swear on this podcast?
Sure.
If everything's fucked, like if the whole way magazines get to consumers is totally screwy, well then how are we going to do this? And so I drew on a lot of years of trying to do things on a shoestring, and still with Bystander, we're doing okay. But I'm always asking for more subscribers, because the more subscribers I have, I can start paying my writers and artists a decent wage. But it's always, we're doing it with Patreon, and it's always complicated. And people who are of a certain age expect that, well, why can't I just go to the bookstore and pick one up? Well, yes, you can, but that requires a kind of scale. Print anything is not a mass medium anymore, and so the distribution structures that really work on, you jam out 5 million copies every month and you sell 2 million, but because of economies of scale, you're printing them in such a way so that you can pulp 3 million copies every month, and it's no big deal, and it's sort of like passive publicity or whatever the numbers are. It's nuts. It's a nuts thing to do, but because people love it, I try to keep doing it.
Right. Well, amazingly, because of the recent events of the pandemic, the way you chose for distribution is probably beneficial, since
yes.
Literally where I went, since we were supposed to speak a little bit earlier, is I said, well, he's not calling. I'll just go out, because Barnes & Noble was open last week. It wasn't today. And so, I usually go once a week. And I said, well, let's go out. And, I was going to go after our talk, but I said, well, I'll go now. And that's where I was. And it's like, nope, we're closed. And it's like, I knew that would happen. So got a bite to eat and then came back home. And it's like, now we're talking. And it's like, adjustments for everything. But, in your case, well, it's kind of like business as usual, because I don't know if you do it at home, but I mean, you still have the distribution set up.
I do it at home. I do it in my front room, believe it or not.
Right.
Which listeners, if you have not read the magazine, you should read it. I'll send you a PDF copy. It looks like a professional magazine.
It is. I'll vouch for you. That's why I'm talking to you. It's a very good magazine.
Yeah, it's. I mean, and that's the thing. Like, I was talking to somebody, not to get off on this tangent, but I think it's worth talking about. I was talking to somebody about my college years, and I said, I didn't know anybody or do. I mean, I was in the the paper and had a following and all that sort of stuff at Yale. So I was known, but I wasn't, and I had my close friends, but most of the time I spent was sitting in sweaty basement rooms in front of these ridiculously ancient Macs. This was 1990. You couldn't even really process a photograph with a Macintosh, just barely. But in any case, so Bystander is really the fruit of 25 or 30 years of tricks. Mm-hmm. Like, I can get an illustration for that this way, or I can write a piece about that, and that will work. Because with a regular magazine, people will pitch, writers will pitch. They'll say, have you ever, who knows the real story behind Altoids? I'd like to write a story about Altoids. Would you be interested in doing that? That's not pitching. Since I can't pay for kill fees, since I can't say, yes, Mark, go write the story on Altoids. You write me a story, and it's slash fiction instead or whatever. And I go, I can't run this, but here's a kill fee. Right. That's how it would go. Mm-hmm. Since I can't pay kill fees, I don't really get pitched very much. And so once again, I've structured the magazine so that unlike a regular magazine, which is really, 12 long-stemmed red roses, it's the same thing, right? Mm-hmm. Vanity Fair is kind of the same, a magazine of the same thing from beginning to end to create an ambiance and experience. With Bystander, it's more that I'm trying to create, a bouquet of wildflowers, and every wildflower is pretty, and you arrange them in a way that makes them all look nice, like great, but it's very diverse. So I had to come up with a magazine that would somehow, Meryl Marco wants to do a cartoon about her friend who works in an animal shelter, and Margaret Cho wants to write about body image, and Brian McConaughey wants to write an article about a piece of fiction set at a nude beach, and blah, 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 blah. So it's interesting because that's a totally different way of doing magazines, too. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if it always works, but it's an interesting challenge. It's an interesting challenge.
Now, how do you get your contributors? I mean, did you just go down the National Lampoon editorial page and say, I'm calling Ed Sabitsky, I'm calling Sherry Flanagan,
Sherry and I are good friends.
Yeah.
And this is the other thing. How to get my people. Some came from Brian. Mm-hmm. Some came from me, working in the business for 25 years. Okay. People know me. And then between those two people, then you're like, well, who do you think you should be part of this? But here was the other part of it. It was like, they need to be a mensch. Mm-hmm. Like, life is too short and the money's too thin here for us to deal with. Because if you hear stories about, like, the National Lampoon or whatever, it's people at each other's throats. And I'm like, we can't do it like this. Right. It's not going to work if we do it like this. And so the people that have been attracted to the venture, because, I mean, I don't know if you can hear this, but I'm a pretty jovial, easygoing guy, Brian is nice, laid back. So, once we gathered a sort of hardcore of people who were menschy, then other people were attracted. And somebody like Sherry, I forget. I'm sure I just wrote her. Or called her and said, "Hey, Sherry, I'm working with Brian and M.K. Brown and some other people on this thing." And then we got talking, and now we're great friends. But that's the other thing, is that Bystander really it runs on the goodwill of all parties. Mm-hmm. Myself, not making nearly as much money as I would like to, enough, really, not even making enough. Mm-hmm. Making, and the contributors certainly not getting paid as much as they should be paid. Should pay them 10 times as much, at least. Mm-hmm. And then the readers, too. The readers are great. Like, it's very much like a club. Yeah. That's very much like a club, and that's what we're trying to create. We're trying to create a place where people love this stuff, can come together and enjoy it. Mm-hmm. And so when you said, hey, you want to talk about stuff, I was like, oh, yes, of course, because you're part of the club.
Right, right.
every once in a while there'll be somebody. It'll either be a contributor or sometimes a subscriber who will see. Oh, you have all those people from National Lampoon. Oh, is it going to be sort of P.J. O'Rourkean jokes about black people or whatever? Like what the Lampoon kind of descended into in the late 70s and 80s.
Right.
And so they're very disappointed.
Right.
They read the Bystander like, oh, this is, there's no jokes about drunken Irishmen in it.
Right.
And so that's one of maybe the biggest challenge.
Yeah.
Is that the audience is so diverse now.
Mm-hmm.
And people are sensitive, and rightly so, to a lot of stuff that in the past people were less sensitive to.
Right.
So it's that's a challenge, and that's once again where you got to have this goodwill.
Mm-hmm.
Because occasionally when somebody writes me and says, "Oh, I was offended by this piece," or you screwed up or whatever,
mm-hmm.
my response is always to say, "Well, I'm sorry about that. That's not our intention. I'll take that under advisement, and the next time I do this, I'll do it better." That's not the attitude that you get from Spy. That's not the attitude you get from Lampoon.
Mm-hmm.
That we're basically like, fuck you.
Yeah.
We're doing this and fuck you. And that works. That's an old media stance that works because we're the editors. We're getting paid $200,000 a year. We have an office in New York, and you're a writer from Winnetka, Illinois.
Mm-hmm.
Well, because of the digital world, we're all on the same kind of playing field.
Right.
Or like you can tweet at the president.
Right.
So that's another reason that I really felt like you have to be nice. This has to be a pleasant.
Right.
It can be funny. It can be acid. It can be acerbic. But the affect of the magazine and the affect of me as the editor is genial. Because we have to recognize, we have to respect the people who are consuming the product.
Right. Now, it strikes me, and I don't know if I'm unique in this opinion, but, is kind of a more sophisticated version of the National Lampoon. So there's no excessive nudity and just complete crassness all the time, or just totally politically incorrect. It has its share of it at times, but I mean, it's kind of like if if Lampoon was for kids in high school or early college, this is like for graduates, kind of like that,
Well, part of that was I was looking at the kind of stuff that Brian likes to write.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was making a magazine for Brian and Jack and George and Merrill and and they're of the different generation. They're not of Michael O'Donoghue, Doug Kenny. Yeah. That school, right?
I was wondering what would happen if they were both around working for you.
Well, it's interesting. I think Doug. I think there's no question. Actually, Brian and I were just talking about this. Brian has a diary that has from that time that has information about his, stuff about Michael O'Donoghue and a couple of other people, and because Brian was around those folks. He was an editor at the very beginning.
Right.
So he just said to me yesterday, "You're going to like this." I said, "What?" He said, I'm going to write up an article about these people. And I said, "Can you get it to me so we can put it in the next issue, 15? I think people would love it."
Mm-hmm.
So as far as Doug is concerned, I don't know what kind of writer Doug would have become, but I suspect that Doug would have been very, very easily fit into the Bystander.
Yeah.
Because Doug was warm. Doug was, of all the writers in the classical Lampoon, Doug was the one that I really grooved on. Mm. And that's, Board of the Rings, the book that he did with Henry Beard, is a direct forebear of my Barry Trotter book. Mm-hmm. And on purpose, because it was kind of like I love that book, and I was writing a bit of an homage to it. One of the things about Doug's death, that's the other person, Harold Ramis. Brian's going to write about Harold Ramis. There were a couple of people that were sort of they were softer than O'Donoghue. They were warmer and softer than O'Donoghue. They could be acerbic. They could be cutting. You know, they could write. Kenny could write that first blowjob piece, that famous first blowjob piece,
Right.
which is pretty horrifying when you read it now. But you also are always glimpsing him in his material. O'Donoghue, not as much. But remind me to tell you something interesting about O'Donoghue after I finish saying this.
Okay.
Kenny and Belushi were, for my money, they were the and Gilda Radner is one of these people, and Ramis too. But Kenny and Belushi they had this common touch. They had this warmth. They had this charmingness that really drove the comedy. And so when they died, and Kenny died in 80 and Belushi died in 82, the people that were left, people like O'Donoghue, people like P.J. O'Rourke, Henry he retired basically.
Yes.
The people that were left were only one facet of the Lampoon's situation. And Brian is a perfect example of this too. Brian is so lovable as a person that I did a whole magazine for him. And that is common in Brian's life. People love Brian. Brian's a lovable person, and he's a unique talent himself. And it's not a surprise that he and Belushi were which he always says Belushi, so maybe that's how you say it. Maybe that's how John said it. But it's not a surprise that he and John were friends, that he and Harold Ramis were friends for many years. So, it's not that this is the other thing. If Michael O'Donoghue were writing today, I don't think he'd be the same writer, because the internet has taken that shock so far.
Right.
That the thing that he was doing, it was a technique that he did.
Yeah.
That he would cause a lot of conflict and upsetness it's really in the body of the reader. You feel it in your body, and you don't know what to do with this emotion, so you laugh.
Yeah.
I once asked Dennis Perrin, his biographer, O'Donoghue's biographer, is a friend of mine.
Okay.
And Dennis is a guy you should talk to just for this or for whatever. He's fascinating and super smart.
Okay.
But the thing about Dennis, so he wrote the biography of Michael O'Donoghue.
Right.
And I once called Dennis about something else, and we were talking, and I said, wait, Dennis, I got to ask you, was O'Donoghue into S&M? and he said, why do you, he stopped, and he said, why do you ask? And I said, well, because I was reading his material lately, and it doesn't seem to be about humor. It seems to be about S&M, these pieces, a couple of these pieces. And he said, well, of course we never had a conversation about it, but I did find in his files certain pieces of pornography that suggested that perhaps he was interested in that. I don't know if that's true. I don't know, but it was so. So the thing about Michael O'Donoghue, Kenny, from his college stuff to the day he died, I'm sure, his goal was to make you laugh.
Right.
That was the thing he loved to do. And charming, warm, witty fellow. O'Donoghue, I don't think he was really trying to make people laugh a lot of the time. I think laughter was the response. I think that humor magazines were free and easy after the 60s and the underground newspapers. I think that that's where he could fit into, but in general, I don't think he was a comedy writer. And I think that by defining Michael O'Donoghue and the school of Michael O'Donoghue as comedy writing, I think comedy writing has done itself a real disservice. I think it's gone down some dead ends as a result.
Right.
And a lot of people who are in the business, who are comedy writers, quotes, are really, in quotes, what they really are is really angry people.
Right. Right.
And that's okay. You know, like, I'm sure Doug Kenny was enraged. I'm sure Groucho Marx was, enraged. But they didn't. But there's a sublimation stage that the great ones can do and do,
Yep.
and that a lot of sort of mid-level comedy writers, it's tough to be around them because they're just fucking furious all the time. So
I am a big fan of O'Donoghue's stuff, but it is
me
true.
too. Me too.
It is true, though, that he seemed to be more intent to try to shock than really try to get you to laugh.
Yeah, or... Oh, sorry, go on.
That was basically my point, I mean, the typical thing that he did on the Lampoon Radio Hour and then later on Saturday Night Live, where he says, I believe fill-in-the-blank celebrity Ed Sullivan or whatever, if they had 10-inch spikes stuck in their eyes, I think it would go something like this. Now, it's hysterically funny, and he's screaming and writhing in pain and everything, but at the same time, is it really that funny? It's more a shock value.
Yeah, and also too, like in a world where, O'Donoghue's famous line about that was that he wrote jokes for a world that was ready to nuke itself out. and I get that.
Yeah.
And I get that. But I would also have to say that if Michael O'Donoghue were alive today, I think he would have seen the limitations of that stance.
Yeah.
In that things have not gotten better since 1975, in my opinion, in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't necessarily think that the comedy, if you love it, if it makes you laugh, like, great. That's the point of it. Like, that's a good thing. But as philosophically, when I think to myself, what does that do? How do you make it? What do you have to twist yourself up into to make it? I mean, not for nothing, Michael O'Donoghue died at 50 or whatever. I mean, there's that aspect too. He was this kind of material was taking a bite out of him. Mm-hmm. Oh, but I wanted to ask you, what do you think about Terry Southern?
Well, I like some of his films. I really adore Magic Christian. I have to admit, it took a few viewings for me to kind of get what was going on, but also because the first time I saw it, I think I was like 12 or something.
Yeah, right.
And we could talk about this, which is fine. I don't have to talk completely about Bystander. I understand you're a huge Beatles fan. Well, I am too. So it's
huge Beatles fan.
Yeah, and so I became a fan about 1977, and so I started looking for as much as I could. And one time they showed Magic Christian on like the Midnight Movie or something on TV, and so we had a VCR back in the beta days, and I taped it, and it was very cut, like the final scene where all the businessmen are waiting around in the shit pool, basically, was completely cut out. So that shows you, they couldn't show everything on TV, at least at this time. But it's like at first I don't know if I liked it. I was just watching it because, hey, Paul McCartney wrote the theme song, Badfinger performed it, and Ringo's in it, and I like Peter Sellers from the Pink Panther movies. But slowly over time, it clicked, and I go, I get it. It's the extremes of what people will do for money. I don't know if that's answering your question about whether I like Terry Southern, but I mean, it's like I've seen Candy too, and that's really still kind of disjointed for me. And then
I've never seen Candy.
Beyond that, I mean, Terry Southern has been affiliated with other things. I can't think of what they are off the top of my head, but in general, I admire the guy and what he's done. So.
Well, the reason that I ask you that is that really O'Donoghue and Terry Southern are, they're two peas in a pod.
Right,
to me.
right, okay.
And so so to understand Michael O'Donoghue, you have to understand Terry Southern's milieu, which is the beats. This is the thing; it's the beatniks.
Right.
And so it's sort of shocking the bourgeoisie and all of that stuff.
Right.
What I think is interesting about Michael O'Donoghue in that way, I'll get back to the Beatles in a second, but what's interesting about Michael O'Donoghue in that way is, before Lampoon came along, he was doing theaters and theatrical things and happenings downtown in Soho and stuff in the early 70s. So, whatever you want to say, whatever you want to say about the people who've taken Michael O'Donoghue as a leaping off point for their material, Michael O'Donoghue had a lot of interesting shit going on in his head. He was like a real artist.
Right.
Like that's what I think is interesting, and that's definitely something. There's an illustrator named Ted Juflos, who is in The Bystander, and his stuff is sort of goth and, O'Donoghue-esque in certain ways. Because of that, it's like humor magazines in the 60s, if this was the Realist, Paul Krasner's,
right.
Paul Krasner worked for Bystander, Paul Krasner's Realist, or, the underground papers, the underground comics, there was just sort of sense of like comedy as being a place where the rules were relaxed, so you could be outrageous and you could be scatological and you could be violent or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So I actually think that was all very salutary, because you had a strong mainstream, you had strong central authority, and so the idea of an underground that was saying, no, we're gonna draw pictures of penises and all sorts of, and we're going to publish them and all the rest of that stuff. I think that was good. I think that was what was needed back in 1965 or whatever.
Right.
But I think in 2020, I think it's so clear that the fissure, that the difficulties of the culture are not things like, or maybe they will become, given things like FESTA and SOSTA, the new laws that are being passed. Generally people can say what they want to say in that regard, but if you don't have $5 million, you can't start a magazine.
Right.
Like that's, and if there was a period of time where you could get on the internet, and if your website was good, you could get a great deal of traffic. Now that's not really the case anymore. It really is a reflection of a sort of, what are the big general interest magazines on the internet? Well, there's the New Yorker, I guess. There's Slate. I mean, the internet's whole spiel was, you're not going to get paid. Nobody's going to get paid anything, but it's going to be this incredibly diverse, wonderful bunch of information. Well, what in fact we are getting is nobody's getting paid except for the people who make the platforms,
mm-hmm.
and it's getting more and more of a monoculture, and that is, to my mind, that's why Bystander exists, because I kept waiting for somebody to do a magazine like this in print,
yeah.
or do it online, and nobody freaking did it, and it was like, well, okay.
Yeah. Well,
I guess I'll finally do it.
I'm glad you did it. I mean, it's like now we don't even have Mad anymore. It's subscription only, yes. I guess, but it's 90% reprint, and it's like,
I don't know. I've been trying to figure out, since that was announced last July, I've been trying to figure out how to get my hands on that and install a better printing model, publishing model, so that it can make money. I think it could make a significant amount of money.
Mm-hmm.
And so I've been leading a team that's been trying to buy that.
Mm-hmm.
But we haven't been able to get anywhere. I don't think AT&T wants to sell it.
Yeah.
And, to be honest, I'm looking here at the April 2020 issue, which is the first reprint issue, and it seemed fine. I think her name is Susie Hutchinson, who does it. She seems like she's doing a great job. Yes, I'm with you. I would like to see it be all new material. The whole thing about Bystander is I'm trying to figure out ways to put money in pockets of writers and artists.
Right.
Because if you can't put money in somebody's pocket in this culture, very few people are going to do it.
Yeah.
And very few people are going to do it enough to get good at it. Mm-hmm. So the level of practitioner is going to go down.
Right.
Oh, one thing before we get off on something else, the Beatles. So I love the Beatles, but one of the reasons I love the Beatles is they're funny.
Mm-hmm.
And just as you're talking about, if you're really, really interested in the Beatles, well, you immediately fall into Monty Python.
Yes.
And you immediately fall into The Goon Show and Peter Sellers.
Yes.
And you immediately fall into Peter Cook and Dudley Moore.
Mm-hmm.
My favorite comedy of all time is Bedazzled, that 67 of Peter Cook and Dudley Moore.
Mm-hmm.
Although Rife O'Brien is pretty wonderful too. So the interesting thing about the Beatles is that, the Ruddles. I mean, the Ruddles are a kind of parody. It's good as National Lampoon ever did, but it's English. It's slightly different. But of course, then the Ruddles documentary is the only melding of the Lampoon people and the Monty Python people that I know of.
And SNL, I guess that's considered Lampoon.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right. Brian once said that to me. That this is why I bring it up. Is he once said that we were looking at what the Monty Python people were doing and thinking, yeah, they're kind of doing what we're doing, but slightly different. It's interesting.
Yeah. And amazingly to me, that Ruddle special when it first aired flopped. I know,
right?
And I watched it. I taped it, and I loved it. My dad, who wasn't a Beatles fan, still isn't. He knew their basic story, but he didn't get it. He didn't think it was funny at all. He said about the only thing that he thought was funny was a scene with Dan Aykroyd where he's smoking a cigarette and he gave up the Beatles and he kills himself a second later. He thought that was kind of funny. But and just occasional throwaway lines like the tight trousers and stuff like that. But most of it he thought was just junk. And he says, I don't understand why you like this show. And I realized probably the reason why it flopped is. And you were a fan then, and I don't know when you became a Beatles fan, but for me it was around '77, so it was right before this special. At that time, it was the real Beatles story wasn't really commonly known. I mean, people knew Sgt. Pepper, people knew Abbey Road, but they didn't necessarily know. Oh, they went to India at this time, and they did this movie and did this tour. The anthology changed all that, and I think now if they did the Ruddles in the first place, it would be a big hit. But, over time it's become a hit anyway because, it's kind of an underground cult classic, and, just because they got it right. Apparently, I think Neil Innes or Eric Idle both saw an early cut of, like, The Long and Winding Road.
That's exactly what I was just about to say to you. I'm glad you said it because I'm going to be like, oh, listen, I've got to drop some Beatle knowledge on you, so you know it. And
also, I believe they watched that David Frost special that aired like in 75 or 76 and because that one has Queenie Epstein on it, and it's just they do that verbatim practically, except she has the tight trousers fit, but I'm googling it right now. David Frost Beatles special. Yeah, I forgot the name of it.
I've never seen it.
Yeah, it originally aired like in 75 or 76, and then they repeated it around 78 or something like that.
No kidding.
And if you watch that, you'll go, oh my God, this is where they got that scene from. This is where they got that scene from. So
David Frost salutes the Beatles.
That's it.
Okay, I'm gonna definitely have to check that out.
I think it's on YouTube in a very kind of crummy condition, but it's watchable. I mean, enough so you can get it, and you probably say, "Oh my God, they must have seen this to do the Ruddles."
Yes. Well, I think it's so interesting because nobody's ever seen those early cuts of The Long and Winding Road.
No.
And I think that it would be worth seeing because it would, I'm interested in the Beatles as a historical event as well, and so I'm always interested in how did they see themselves, how did that change, how did people see them over time. So in 1975, or whenever they, I think they were cutting. Neil Aspinall was cutting together The Long and Winding Road, in 71 or 72, right after they broke up. I would be very interested in seeing that, just to see how different that was from the anthology cut that we saw. And then there's another cut of anthology which you can see occasionally, which has all sorts of interesting little snippets, like everybody's being rougher on Yoko. You can see how the sausage gets made a little bit, and I'm always interested in that with the Beatles because that is so much of the story.
I haven't seen that uncut version. I've had it available, but it's usually like priced too much higher than I want to pay for it. So it's like I go for maybe not much more. I mean, have you seen it then? So
I've seen snippets.
Okay.
I've never for exactly the same as you. I don't want to spend $75 because I don't know how different it is really.
Yeah. I mean, if it says like one more sentence, it's like, and fuck Yoko. Big deal. Exactly. I don't care.
Right. And Yoko stole my McVitie's biscuits. That's a long running joke on my Beatles blog, Hey Doll blog. Everybody's always reminding about George Harrison going fucking ballistic in 1969 when when Yoko steals some of his biscuits. Yeah, those guys. The thing about the Beatles, one of the things that made them so special was they're so goddamn funny.
Yes.
I mean, like, they're really smart, and because they're really smart, they're really funny.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, I would, it's funny that you say this. I do Bystander because the Beatles weren't hiring. That's what I wanted to do. I wanted to be a Beatle. But when I was 14 or whenever, and we're ready, okay, I'm ready to go. I'll be Lennon or McCartney to someone's Lennon or McCartney. I didn't find that person, and so I went and did comedy writing instead. It was a conscious decision. It was like, well, I'd love to be a performer. I'd love to be a Beatle. I'd love to play music, but I don't have a band, and I don't know of anybody. And interestingly enough, I don't think, like, for example, one of the things that makes the Beatles so fascinating is that there's each of them is musical in a different way.
Yeah.
So McCartney is definitely one of those guys who's just sort of naturally musical.
Right.
Surely he's practiced in immense amounts, but he's just sort of naturally gifted, you can see. Lennon's really interested in it as a way to get across whatever he wants to get across. George is interested in it for different reasons. Ringo's interested in it for different reasons. So, it's the alchemy of those four is just truly incredible.
Yeah.
It doesn't that those four people were in the same place at the same time, coming together in that particular way is. It's an incalculable odd, So it's interesting.
Now, what got you into the Beatles in the first place?
Well, how do I say this? I don't want to be like one of those guys who's like, oh yeah, I was into this when I was a little boy. I was into this when I was a little boy. But I was into the Beatles as a little kid too.
Okay.
My aunt, it was all the same to me. Like the comedy stuff and the Beatles stuff was the same because. My mother was raising me by herself. I was spending a lot of time with a younger aunt. So every Friday night, I would stay over at my Aunt Peg's, and my Aunt Peg was 60-some-odd. And we would watch old movies and all sorts of things. And so I knew old culture, Abbott Costello, all this, Marx Brothers, all that stuff from when I was a little boy. And you can see this in Lampoon, too. The 70s, there's this period where old stuff, nostalgia they called it then, but it's just sort of old stuff is being repurposed into the culture for the first time.
Right.
And so that was happening, and I was really interested in, like, say, the movie King Kong. I loved it, and then my younger aunt, who had been a Beatles fan originally, and St. Louis, believe it or not, I don't know why this is, but it could be because George's sister lives near St. Louis, or lived. I think she's still alive. Louise lived outside in downstate Illinois, not too far from St. Louis. But in any case, the Beatles were always a big deal in St. Louis, even after they broke up. So, like, there was just a bunch of stuff. There was always a bunch of, and Mary, my younger aunt. So I'd stay Friday nights with Peggy, and then Saturday nights with Mary. And Mary was, all of 22 in 1973 or 4, or whatever it was. And totally into music, totally into all her old Beatles stuff. I was just absorbing like crazy. I was absorbing all of that. There's a picture of me from before I could talk, listening to Back in the USSR, and like totally, you can see by my face, I'm totally like digging it. And so, I don't know. It's weird. It was just. I've always been interested in them, and I've always been interested in the sort of things around them, like Nielsen, like Python, like all that stuff. It is still, because the world is so frightening right now. I will probably sit down and watch something about swinging London.
Right.
It's my happy place.
Yeah. I'm doing similar things. I mean, I have to work from home. When I play the music, I'm playing like Kinks today, but it's like I'm playing that type of stuff. Early Fleetwood Mac a little bit, things like that. But I do play a lot of Beatles, so right now I'm taking kind of a holiday from it. But
yes, you do. You do that, right? You know, what kind of Kinks? What Kinks are you listening to?
Late '60s stuff right now, but you know, I'll listen to their whole career. I don't even mind Phobia that much. It's like, you know, but I actually, you know, since we're mentioning Kinks, is the late '70s stuff on Arista. That's my favorite era, and which is not necessarily everybody's favorite era. You know,
I don't think I've ever heard it, really.
Well, their big hits during that period were like "Come Dancing" and "Destroyer" and you know, jukebox music, things like that. You know, but there was none of this theming and stuff. You know, they weren't doing like Preservation, and they weren't doing soap opera and those type of things that they did during the early '70s. It was just straight rock and roll. You know.
See, this is interesting because I really, you know, speaking about Bystander, so what's the connection between that and Bystander? Well, this is what the connection is. if you look at the Kinks, if you look at starting with Sgt. Pepper, you know, there's this sense of you get your skills right to be able to be to work in a popular medium, and then what's the next thing you do? You create, like a film director creates, a bigger experience. Right. And that's what Bystander is. Yeah. Because for me, I graduated from humor pieces, you know, New Yorker, writing for Saturday Night Live, whatever, to doing a parody of Harry Potter, which was you know, I designed it and did it all. I mean, it was trying to be immersive. It was for people who were complete Harry Potter fanatics, and I was making jokes about it's like All You Need Is Cash. Yeah. You go, you know, or Board of the Rings. You go deeply into a fandom, and you talk about it as a fan. You talk about it as a fellow appreciator. But you're trying to create an immersive, intense experience. Right. And that, for me, was the Bystander is the culmination of that, where every single page I'm looking at it and going, okay, you know, how does this fit with the rest? Yeah. And you know, sometimes I wish I had help because I can't, because it's so big and I have to do so many issues. I have to do 4 a year, and each one is, you know, 80 pages or whatever it is. It's a lot of stuff. Yeah. So you know, some issues I feel I do a better job than others, but at this point, with now 14 done and 15 half done, I think you can look at it as a brick of work and go, okay, this is what this guy was trying to create. And it's very similar to, I was arguing on my website with somebody, I love Revolver, but I prefer Pepper. And they're like, oh, no, Revolver's got better songs. I'm like, absolutely right, better songs than Revolver. But Pepper is different because Pepper is, from the beginning, it's trying to create a unified experience. Right. From the cover to the inserts to the songs to everything. Yeah. And the interesting thing about it is, Mark, that everybody perceived it as that unified experience. They got it. We look at it and we go, oh, it's a concept album, but there's no concept. Right. You know, like, what's the concept? There's no concept. It's just bullshit. It's just McCartney being bullshitty. And I go, no. It's Pepper so fundamentally sums up what was going on in a small, very important group of English creators from late 1966 to early 1967. It encapsulates its time. That's why there's a writer who says something famous about, he drives across the country, the United States, the first week that Pepper is out, and he says, all I heard on the radio, every radio from New York to Los Angeles was Sgt. Pepper. Yeah. And so it's great, amazing quality is that it summed up its time. Right. That means that it's not going to age as well as, say, Abbey Road. Yeah. Because it's of its time. Right. You know. For me, Sgt. Pepper, and this is after knowing their whole career. It wasn't when I first heard it.
it was finally where they could sit down and say, all right, what can we do if we don't have to do all these TV shows and tours and personal appearances, and if we could just sit down and basically create a concert experience. That's why they put the audience on there at the beginning and a little bit at the end, just to kind of say, there isn't really a theme other than, hey, if we could create our own show and put it on a disc, this is what we would do. And instead of all the chaos and all the other nonsense when they went to the Philippines and all the other places, it's like they could just, create their own world, as it were. And, once they did that, they said, hey, this is kind of fun. But you can only create your own world so many times, and, along with everything else, I think after Abbey Road, it's like, okay, we created our world about 5 times here now. What else can we do? We could just keep doing it, I suppose, but,
this is an interesting question. Well, first of all, I'll tell you, do you know that the crowd noise comes from Beyond the Fringe?
Yes.
Okay, you
I did that,
okay. I figure you know all the stuff.
I've been reading Mark Lewison for years. Anyway,
there you go. So maybe other people don't. But
that's fine to say.
Interesting because, of course, there's tremendous overlap between that 4 and the Beatles 4 too.
Yeah.
The thing is, we talk about this with on the Adult Blog. I'm a believer. People say, the Beatles quit. They quit at the perfect time. They quit while they were ahead. And I always say, the thing about the Beatles is that nobody expected them, and then once they were started, nobody knew what they were going to do next. And their ability to reinvent themselves incredibly fast and incredibly completely. And so I think to myself, well, you're right, surely, that was a good time to leave, and the 70s were not the 60s, and who knows, maybe they would have deteriorated, because it's usually people saying, they would have, it would have been silly love songs or whatever else. I think to myself, yeah, except that in 1963, nobody was thinking about Abbey Road, or nobody was thinking about Rubber Soul.
Right.
After Rubber Soul, nobody was thinking about Sgt. Pepper. Sgt. Pepper, nobody was thinking about the White Album. The White Album, nobody was thinking about, it's like they were constantly evolving.
Right.
And so I'm not so sure that they wouldn't have continued to pull rabbits out of their hat because of the process, because of the people that they were and the process that they were doing. And there would have been albums, better albums or worse albums. But I just think when you're talking about geniuses, and I don't know if they're all geniuses individually, but certainly as a group they were a genius. Mm-hmm. I think that's where, and similarly, that first early staff of National Lampoon from, say, 71 to 75 or 74, there's definitely the group genius there. Yeah. That's absolutely true. And it's unfair, as most people do. Brian says, Doug Kenny was our Marilyn Monroe. And people, and because he was handsome, and because he was a good interview and all that sort of stuff, and because he was great. He was a funny, great guy. But Lampoon would have been nothing like what it was without Henry Beard. Henry Beard's a humor editor, humor magazine editor. I looked to Henry Beard and I was just like, man, you're the fucking real stuff, buddy. That's great.
Yeah.
So, it was all of them. And they would have been much lesser without O'Donoghue. They would have been lesser without Jerry Sussman.
Yeah.
Bruce McCall. People who now, are more or less. Well, Brian's a perfect example. Brian added something that nobody, just a little tip. You don't edit somebody like Brian McConaughey. He gives you this thing, and you're like, wow, that's weird, Brian. What are you trying to get at with this? Oh, okay, good. I think that'll work. What about making that a little shorter? Okay, yes, maybe a little shorter. Or whatever it is. Mm-hmm. But those guys were all so formed as creative people, also
right.
Already set, that there's no, so with Bystander, it's much more, what I'm trying to do is get those old war horses, get them in here so that people who are younger can look and go, oh, that's how it's done, and then do their version of that, because their version is going to be different. And with the Onion people, too, I do that Pardon me, I've got a frog in my throat.
That's okay.
So you tired of this yet?
Yeah. No. I was going to say a couple of comparisons, though. I mean, it's like for everybody who says, well, what would the Beatles be like? In a certain sense, if they stayed together, the certain sense, I guess it'd be like the Rolling Stones. Because they kept making good albums for at least another decade. And, now it's got to the point, and every artist seems to do this, they get to the point where if somebody puts out a new album, nobody cares. They just want to hear the old hits, and it just happens. And then the comparison for Lampoon, would be like Mad even. It's like Mad, now everybody always says, well, it used to be good in fill in the blank date. Right. I think one of the writers said, Mad is always the funniest whenever you were 11. It's, and it's like, and I think somebody else said this about Mad. The best issue of Mad was the issue before you started reading it. So, and there's some truth to that. Some weird, perverse way, but in a certain way, it's like had the Beatles stayed together, great, but I think after time people would say enough already or something. It sounds incredible, but it's
yes, I don't. Who can say? I think I'm a big believer in the idea, which some people don't know about, and some people do. I think that in 1979, the Beatles, the four Beatles, signed a piece of paper which basically said, we are preparing to perform again together. Mm-hmm. And so you know that. And it was, speaking to the non-Beatles obsessives who are listening, it was to give them a stronger legal case against Beatlemania, the sound-alike band that was on Broadway. I actually think that was legitimate. I don't think that was just a legal maneuver. I think that there are a lot of circumstantial things that suggested that Lennon and McCartney certainly were thinking about writing together again. Yeah. And then if you have Lennon and McCartney, the hard one would have been Harrison, but and I think that the anthology only happened because Harrison suddenly needed a lot of money. And I mean, lucky for us, he did. But in any case, I have a strong belief in the creative individual. I really do. That we can't necessarily predict what will happen. But if there's somebody who is really gifted, that their knack doesn't go away. Yeah. Maybe it gets slower or something like that. So like for example. What would Doug Kenny have done? I don't know what he would have done, but
Caddyshack 12. No, just kidding.
Yeah, well, I mean, maybe, but I think he had a lot more to say.
Yeah, I think he would have. Actually, I think he would have tried completely different films, and I think he would have been totally aghast at the fact that they bothered to make a Caddyshack 2. Right. Regardless if it was good or bad, it had nothing to do with that. It's like, I don't think he would never want an Animal House 2, or anything else that he ever did. He was like a one-and-done type person. There was no Lord of the Rings 2 or whatever you want to call it. It was like, this is my piece. This is what is the famous book he did? I can't even think of it. The yearbook, the high school yearbook or whatever. Right. There was never a sequel to that. I mean, the sequel, I guess, could be Animal House in a certain way, but it wasn't
you could say that.
A direct print sequel. They didn't do that. Or he didn't do that. And I think. And even the Beatles didn't really do that, and comparing it to that, you could argue Magical Mystery Tour could be Sgt. Pepper Part 2, but, it just happens to be, because it has songs that came out the same year, but it's its own thing,
By the way, I gotta say, because you brought it up, I probably wouldn't have said it unless you brought it up, but Magical Mystery Tour is probably my second favorite Beatles album. And I know that that's a weird thing to say, but I love the songs. Yeah. I love the songs. I think it's once again, I think it's a snapshot of culture that I particularly like. I'm always nattering on about this on Hey Del Blog. There's a certain point where the psychedelic culture was still sort of utopian. Mm-hmm. You know, there was a sense that if everybody could drop acid, then a lot of the shit would fall away, and we'd be able to move forward on certain things and all the rest. Yep. And I've never taken acid. I have no opinion about this, except that I like the optimism, and I like the art, and because I think the art is this weird melding of technology and psychedelia and vaudeville, old-fashioned stuff. Yep. That's the thing that's great about fucking Pepper, is that it's stuff from it's like they're all dressed up like they're from 1915. Right. That's crazy. You know, I mean, like that's not that. I don't know how to say this, but that's the kind of there's a cultural confidence that you see in that particular era, because they say we're so confident that we can go back to other eras and pluck things out and change them to how we like them. Yeah. And use them. And, of course, you know, postmodernism and all that stuff. So partly that's what I'm trying to do with Bystander, is going back to 60s and 70s culture and saying, you know, I like this particular look. I think this particular look is good. I think this type of material is good. I think Seymour Quast is a huge hero of mine. I'm running his fucking drawings, like, on the same sort of way that you're trying to kind of create a world of the old and the new, and you take it all and you make it into something that encompasses more than just yourself, right? More than just, you know, an attempt to make a buck or be popular or whatever it is. So I definitely look back. There is a type of illustration that you see in the movie Yellow Submarine, who, by the way, not Quast and Milton Glaser. It's a guy named Heinz Edelman. You probably know that. Yeah. But so those guys, the American designers, Seymour Quast and Milton Glaser at Pushman Studios, which is a direct influence to Bystander, they influenced at that time Heinz Edelman in the design of Yellow Submarine. There's a type of illustration in that movie that I've since discovered that it was a particular type of technology that was being used in the mid-'60s, which I'm always trying to figure out an excuse to get into the Bystander, because it's got this great, you can use these old-fashioned illustrations, but you change them in such a way. So it's like, you know, I did a parody, probably my best parody was a parody of Downton Abbey. And it was a bunch of illustrations. It was a story that I wrote. I had to do it so quickly. I was writing it and illustrating it simultaneously, and it was all these illustrations from Edwardian, Victorian Edwardian popular science magazines, because they're copyright free. Right. And it's the same sort of thing. You're getting this weird kind of mixture. Anyway, your listeners now know way too much about my internal process.
Well, I guess that's why we find similar tastes in things, and, you know, seemingly get along here, because, I mean, I don't know if you know all my background. You know, it's like I write.
What is your background?
So I write books about comic books and animation and music.
Oh, I didn't know that.
And I do have a Beatles book. It's called Mark Arnold Picks on the Beatles, and I just write my own. I write my own opinions about all their songs, group and solo, released and unreleased, up until about 10 years ago, because that's when I published it. But I did 2 Monkeys books, and then as far as animation, I have a book about Total Television, which is the people that made Underdog and Tennessee Tuxedo.
I love those. Yeah.
Did a book about Patty Freeling. They did Pink Panther and a number of other cartoons, and. Let's see. Did a Dennis the Menace book. I love Harvey Comics. I did a Harvey Comics book. You know, things like that. So
great. This is all really interesting.
So, a lot of my stuff is, you know, stuff that I just grew up with. It is like 60s and 70s stuff. A lot of it's based in New York more than anywhere else, or England or whatever. You know, it's like, and LA, I guess, to a certain extent. You know, but I mean and you know, I'm always fascinated with that stuff. You know, and it's like so. when you came up with the American Bystander, I said, at last, somebody is putting out
Right.
something that kind of, is like that. Because I was saying, I don't know if you saw later examples, of like later issues of, say, Cracked or anything like that. And they're just poor examples of what was, because they lost
Sure.
all their artists and writers.
Right.
And even later issues of Lampoon, were just
Exactly.
pathetic. I'm one of
Yes.
these ones. I don't think it stopped in '75. I think it was good until probably about '83, '84, and then it really, fell off after that. It's like everything has its place, has its day, and stuff like that.
Yeah,
But it's like,
that's
where
right.
where do these artists and writers go? It's like they got to do something, So
Mark, it's really interesting because at this point the task ahead of me is, and I've said this to people before, I'm building this for 100 years.
yeah,
I want to build it for 100 years. If it's not, we've been in business for 5. That's amazing. Like 5 years, because it's just me,
Yeah.
doing it. But I really want it to be an institution.
All right, I want to thank you, Michael, for being my guest today on the show. Is there any website that you'd like to plug, or any email, or how can people get in contact with you or the American Bystander?
Yes, I'll tell you all of that. But before I do, I just want to say it was a real pleasure for me, too. As before we started, I said to you, oh, man, I'm feeling a little low energy. And I'm trying not to overwork because of the virus, right?
Right.
But I've really enjoyed our conversation, and I hope that your listeners enjoy it too. It's nice to. It's always nice to talk with somebody who's as passionate about these topics as you are. There's an easy way to get in touch with me. My email, of course, is publisher@AmericanBystander.org. Our website is AmericanBystander.org, and you can download a couple of sample issues, full PDFs, so you'll get a sense of what this is all about if you haven't seen issues. And then there's, of course, our Patreon, which is www.patreon.com/bystander. That's how you subscribe, and you can subscribe at the $5 level, and you get a PDF, or the $20 level, and you get a print copy. And the print magazine is more like a book. It's more like a softcover book. So nobody's ever in 5 years said, these $20 issues, these are too expensive. You're ripping us off. I think you'll find them very worthwhile. And then finally, we're about to launch a website, which I'm not going to talk about, that seems kind of strange, doesn't it? But there is something that we've been working on this thing, which is coming out soon, which I think people are really going to like. But in the meantime, we're doing something special for this particular time. We're doing a free Substack newsletter called Quarantine Cavalcade. And so let me see how you can get to that. I'm going to go on my web. I'm going to go on the web right now and get to it myself, and I can tell you. But that is, we are running material from our writers and artists and other people too, new people as well, that we're about this time, but just sort of about anything if you want, and people are really liking it. It's the AmericanBystander.substack.com. That seems to be where, we're doing all this via email, so I've never really given out a URL before. Yeah, I think the AmericanBystander.substack.com will you can poke around the website, you can subscribe for the emails and all that sort of thing. But if you ever have any questions or you just want to chat with me about the Beatles, I am available at publisher@AmericanBystander.com.
Okay, and what's your Beatles blog again?
Well, it's called HeyDullblog.com.
Okay.
HeyDullblog. So like Hey Bulldog, but spoonerized, I guess.
Right.
Switched. It started in 2008. It was a bunch of people from the New York publishing business who all realized we knew each other, but we'd never talked about the Beatles. And we all realized, we're all huge Beatles fans. So we started doing this, and it was me and Ed Park, and Ed Park was then, I think he might have been editor of The Believer then. He was for a while, but while he was doing the site. And then there was also a fellow named Devin McKinney, who was a wonderful writer and critic. If you haven't, Mark, if you haven't read his book on the Beatles called Magic Circles, You definitely ought to. It's really, really good.
I'm not familiar with that one, yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's, if I had an extra copy, I'd send one to you right now.
Okay.
But, so Devin and I, and now we have a person named Nancy Carr who's writing stuff. So we have great people. The commenters kind of ebb and flow, but we have a reputation of having particularly good comments and particularly respectful and interesting discussions, which I'm always trying to moderate. But with Bystander, it's not like I have a ton of extra time.
Right.
Anyway, but yeah, so check it out. If you like the Beatles, there's probably 800 posts at this point.
Wow.
And it's all sorts of weird stuff about the Beatles and people talking about their obsessions and a lot of things that have become kind of common beliefs. Like, for example, that John Lennon wasn't purposely trying to break up the Beatles. He was trying to get Paul McCartney's attention. That was first that theory was first sort of put out on Dull Blog in the early days, and now you read it in Rolling Stone that it was all this big misunderstanding. And so I do it for fun, but people say they like it, so check it out if you like the Beatles.
All right. Well, I thank you again, and it's been great talking with you.
You too. Thank you so much for your time and for everybody's attention. I hope it was half as fun it was for me.
Okay. All right, and have a great night then.
You too.
Thank you for listening, and thank you, Michael Gerber, for being my special guest. Episode number 74 will be coming soon. If you would like to comment and or be a guest on this podcast, please drop me a line at funideas.mark@gmail.com. Become a Patreon of Mark Arnold and Fun Ideas Productions. If everyone listening just contributed $1 a month, that would be a tremendous help in continuing the production of my books and this podcast. Also, subscribe to my YouTube channel. The opening and closing music for the Fun Ideas podcast is provided courtesy of Andrew the Slow Poisoner Goldfarb and is used with permission. This has been the Fun Ideas podcast. This is Mark Arnold speaking. This episode is copyright 2020, Fun Ideas Productions. Thank you, and good night.
Headed home to a cardboard hut with duct tape doors. At the price I'm paying, be glad it isn't yours. Now get up, Crab Mountain, get up. 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 That mountain of crab. And don't fall back. Don't fall back. Don't fall